Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
I'm delighted to be welcoming even to the programme a former CIA operations officer who worked in Europe and the Middle East and who is currently a contributing editor for the American Conservative site. He wrote a terrific article a couple of days ago which was sent to me by Paul Craig Roberts, our friend who is on the programme from time to time. The article entitled "Taking Down British Officials, Israel Conspires Against the Mother of Parliament." This is pretty timely. Let's welcome to the programme Philip Giraldi. Philip, welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
Well, thank you, Rich. Thank you for having me on.
It's terrific to have you on, Philip. It's an honour. First of all, just out of curiosity, where is Purcellville?
Well, it's not too far from Washington, about 50 miles out west of Washington.
Good stuff. It's in the suburbs. Because I mentioned today on Facebook that you'd be joining us from DC, but I'd never heard of Purcellville before. It's a lovely name. Sounds brilliant. Listen, thanks so much for coming on the programme. Your article is brilliant. I've tweeted it out today and we've got a lot of comment on it. First of all, Philip, what did you think of the official UK government response to what Massoud was doing, meeting with Maria Strizzolo and trying to get Alan Duncan sacked? I believe the government said, we have a great relationship with Israel. It's being dealt with. End of story. What did you think of that response?
Well, the response was kind of pathetic. I mean, here we have something extremely serious where an intelligence officer of a foreign country, a friendly country, is conniving with a government official of that country to get rid of a minister, and also talking in terms of getting rid of an elected parliamentarian. So this is really serious stuff, and the response was basically, we're friends with Israel, case closed. I understand that now there is a likelihood that there will be some kind of investigation, but it's not clear to me what exactly that would entail.
And the irony, of course, as pointed out in the first paragraph of your article, is that while this was going on, the Russians were being accused of interfering in your presidential election. And as you point out, there is no evidence to date that this is true. Am I to understand, Philip, and I have asked this of other guests recently, that even today, no serious, say it for me, no serious police force or the FBI have actually analysed the Democratic National Committee servers, that nobody's actually looked at the servers? They're making these claims against the Russians with no proof. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. There's been no proof of any kind provided by the U.S. government in this case. And it also emerged, as you are correctly observing, that the actual server that is the centerpiece of this case has never been examined by the FBI or by the NSA or by the CIA or by anyone except by a private company that was paid for by the Democratic Party. So they came up with, one has to assume, a conclusion that was satisfactory to the Democratic Party, which in this case consisted of blaming it on Russia.
Well, you know, and I want to talk more about that in a minute, and the belief, because a lot of people in the independent media are, and I can understand this, they're very happy with the idea that Trump is going to try and normalise relations with Russia. I'm not sure it's as straightforward as that. We might talk about that in a second. On the whole Alan Duncan thing and the Israeli diplomat trying to get him thrown out, not just to be the devil's advocate, Philip, but to be fair, don't countries do these things all the time? I mean, don't countries have diplomats working in various other countries doing this under the table sort of stuff? And it's just that the Israelis got caught this time. Isn't it a normal thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Having been a CIA officer myself, I can assure you that it is a normal thing to try to do these things. But the understanding is that when you're doing these things, if you get caught and you're in a friendly country doing these sorts of things, the consequences can be catastrophic. If the United States is caught, for example, were caught in the UK doing what the Israeli official, let's be honest, he's an intelligence officer, what he was doing the furor in the British media would be incredible. Or what if he were a Russian doing this, or an Iranian? So here we have a kind of special handling situation because it's Israel, and this is due in the United States and in Britain to the great power of what you might refer to as the Israeli lobby, or one Jewish organizational lobby, whatever you want to call it. But the fact is that the tremendous power of this lobby has basically made them somewhat immune to the normal handling that they would receive from the media and the public.
Philip, you talk to everybody. We've got Philip Giraldi on the line, by the way, folks. Philip, of course, vastly experienced CIA operations officer. And I see your resume is very impressive, Philip. You've spoken, as well as what you've done in your career, you've spoken to all the top news agencies, and you've got a great understanding of the media. Do you think it's the case that people in the United States, ordinary Joes like me, and in the United Kingdom, they're completely unaware of the influence of the Israeli lobby in their countries? Is that fair to say?
I think that is fair to say, though certainly in my country, that's been changing a bit. The perception has shifted, where most Americans now basically want to be even-handed in the Israel-Palestine conflict. That would not have been the case 5 years ago. And 5 years ago, you and I would not be having this conversation, because the article that you read, I would not have been able to get printed anywhere. So there's been a decided shift in terms of the willingness of people to listen to alternative news. And I'm sure your program fits into that category also in the UK. The mainstream media has let us down so many times lately that people look for other explanations and other answers, and that's a good thing.
Tell me this, Philip. I want to talk about because that segues into a question about, I mean, you talked about the Labour Friends of Israel and the Conservative Friends of Israel, and that the influence might be waning slightly because it's no longer a prerequisite that a Labour MP, a new member of Parliament, would sign up. But I think it's the Conservative Friends of Israel. I think if you become a Conservative MP, as you say in your article, you must become a member of the Conservative Friends of Israel. And before we talk about that, what sort of blowback does somebody like you get for writing about these issues and calling out the truth? I mean, telling the truth about the extraordinary influence of Tel Aviv, of the Israeli government, on your domestic politics, on the Senate and on the Congress. I mean, do you have to put up with allegations or threats or, accusations of racism and anti-Semitism? Does that happen to you?
Yes, that happens to me, and it happens to anyone else who writes on this subject. But I would be more specific in terms of my own background. I started writing for the American Conservative and appearing on television back in 2003, and the initial issue that I was speaking out on was my opposition to the invasion of Iraq. Now, I used to appear on Fox News, I used to appear on NBC, CBS, all the major channels would have me on. But then when it became clear that Israel played a role in the march to war, and I was not too shy to mention that, suddenly all those outlets where I had been appearing and talking about Iraq, which was just fine with them, suddenly they shut down. And I stopped appearing in those places.
That's a terrible thing, isn't it? I saw a documentary once, I think it might have been Outfoxed, about Murdoch's war on journalism. And the scenario you described was played on the movie screen in the theatre when I saw that documentary, about how people who were, like yourself, experienced men like yourself, were asking questions that weren't appreciated or making comments. They were just kind of sidelined and they weren't called anymore or phoned by the producers. It's a terrible thing that. Is the Israel influence, I mean, we talk a lot here about the plans to expand Israel. Do you see that, Philip? Is that, we talk about from, I know this by rote normally, but expanding to the Euphrates. Did they want to ultimately expand the borders of the country? Is that what's going on here?
Well, there are some Israelis, hardliners, I would describe them, who believe that biblical prophecy has given them all the land between the Euphrates and the Nile.
And the Nile, yeah.
And some of them actually believe this. One of the ministers, Bennett Naftali, appears to believe that. There are some others that also come out with similar arguments, and there are a number of others who believe that taking the West Bank completely is an option, which would mean, of course, ethnic cleansing or removal of the Palestinian residents. So you hear that kind of thing, but then there are other Israelis. There is a reasonably strong peace movement in Israel, people who want peace and want to return at least much of the West Bank to create a Palestinian state. They have a voice too. But the current government is indeed very hardline and very much committed to expanding control over the West Bank incrementally and with Donald Trump's apparent acquiescence as quickly as possible.
It's a wonderful thing that you said that. There is, and we often talk about it. I mean, most of the Jewish men and women I've come across professionally are appalled by the crimes of the Israeli government towards the Palestinians and don't want to see that continue. It's very important to make that point always when we talk about these things. Are you worried now that we might see history repeating itself? Are you worried when you hear Michael Flynn talk about, well, he says, we've got to basically, to paraphrase what he said, we're going to take a stronger line with Iran. Trump said the deal Obama did with Iran wasn't good. We know that Netanyahu and his hardliners like Naftali Bennett and others are putting a lot of pressure. Are you worried that this might escalate, Philip? I mean, that's a terrifying scenario, that tension between Iran and the United States and Israel gets to the point where, I mean, who knows what might happen. Is that a concern for you?
Yeah, and it's good that you raised that point, because the situation with Iran is a specific case where you can document fairly clearly that it is the Israeli view of Iran that pervades Washington opinion making. And the Israeli view has become the dominant way of looking at Iran as a threat. The reality is that Iran does not and cannot threaten the United States, and it does not and cannot threaten Europe. The fact is, these are largely fictions that have been created to have Iran as a permanent enemy, because Israel perceives Iran as a permanent enemy. I think Michael Flynn is delusional on this issue. There's some of his policy pronouncements are at least at the base sensible, but he tends to go off in a fantasy on some of these issues, and I think he is really completely wrong about Iran. I don't think it's because he is closely tied to Israel, but I think it's just something that he has been, from what people in the Defense Department have been saying, that he has been delusional on this issue for many, many years.
Yeah, he's talked in the past about Islam being a problem and stuff like this, and you and I both know that there are radical jihadists. We know the Wahhabi form of Islam, the Saudi version of it. We understand this. We're not stupid, but ultimately, of course, that sort of, generalization made by people like him is not helpful. I want to ask you a cheeky question, Philip, before we talk about whether the influence is waning, and maybe this is why we're seeing so many accusations of anti-Semitism. I mean, you know all about the accusations made about the Labour Party and other people. But before we talk about that, thanks for coming on the programme, by the way. I'm enjoying chatting with you. Before we talk about that, when I got excited a few years back when the former French foreign minister worked under Mitterrand, Roland Dumas, basically blew the whistle as far as I'm concerned and said, look, the problems that we see in Syria now were created by the intelligence agencies of the UK and the United States. And he said he was in London, I think in 2008 or 2009, and he was asked to participate, that there was a movement going to be made against Syria. Is it pretty simple? Is it as simple as that? Now, look, okay, in war, atrocities are committed by every side. People do bad things. But is the situation in Syria, has that been brought to bear by the intelligence agencies of the United States and the UK? Is it fair to say that?
Well, having worked in intelligence, I'd have to be honest with you. I'd say that Intelligence agencies are like huge vacuum cleaners. They're pulling in all kinds of information, and it comes out sort of, to use another expression, like a smorgasbord. And you kind of select what you want and what you need that fits what you think your country's interests are. So it's always easy to blame the intelligence agencies, but ultimately it's the politicians who make the choices. And President Obama basically was the one who was very keen on regime change in Syria for humanitarian reasons. And of course, this was what drove his thinking about what had to be done with Syria. Someone who was more serious, who thought about interests and about how policy should be shaped, would have said, well, Bashar al-Assad doesn't threaten us in any way, no way possibly. And they might have questioned why, on a humanitarian basis, a country should basically go to war with another. Yeah. And so the politicians are essentially the ones who make the final decision. And I think blaming on the intelligence agencies is a convenient cop-out, but it's essentially, it's not the whole story.
No, I think you're right. I think, that's something that we've not really considered. So you have these NGOs then with ties to people like George Soros, and you have genuine opposition in Syria. Now, the United Nations said that the guy was a good guy. He was looking to transition to a more accepted form of democracy. He was a reluctant president anyway, as we know. But what about the idea that NGOs, and of course that's not the intelligence agencies, so don't get the blame for that, George Soros and others, getting involved in the discontent that might have been genuine amongst some people in Syria, and feeding those groups with weapons, with ammunition, and doing worse. The Saudis then unleashing into Syria these Wahhabi lunatics who, of course, go and do the most unspeakable things. We've got to consider that, do we, before we move on from this subject? What do you think?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Obviously, if you're having a lot of people who are discontented with the government, that discontent can translate into all kinds of things. And in this case, we had people with agendas, and the Saudis would be among them, the Qataris, NGOs, the United States acting through CIA and funneling weapons into Syria by way of Turkey from Libya. It gets very complicated. But the fact is, there were all these players had agendas, and they empowered the opposition in Syria to become more violent and to create something like a civil war in that country. So I think there's a lot of blame to go around. Certainly the Syrian government can be blamed for allowing this situation to go in the direction that it did. But the West in general and the Gulf states, I think, bear a considerable part of the weaponizing of the conflict and the turning it into a civil war.
And just to go back then to the Israeli influence in US and UK politics, you and I know that the vast majority of people, if they knew the truth, they'd be horrified. American men and women, and I think you can generalise, the vast majority of people in any country in the world are decent. They want to have a decent life, look after their children, make some money if they can, and just get on with life. People don't want this. And yet we end up government after government after government who pursue these policies, these lunatic, in my opinion, policies, which cause the deaths and destruction of millions of people, create genuine terrorism, I believe, Philip. So you have all of this. How serious an influence then is the state of Israel on all of this in the UK and in the United States? I mean, a listener has just tweeted me from Texas, and he said, Richie, our government is basically run from Tel Aviv. Is that going too far, or is that fairly accurate?
That's going too far, but I would say it's true that the government of Israel, both in Britain and the United States, and I would actually throw France in with that, has considerable influence over foreign policy and other related issues as it involves the Middle East. So I think that it's fair to say that in the Middle East, where the United States and Britain and France would not be engaged under normal circumstances, certainly not engaged in terms of these negative programs that we've seen pursued, basically are pursuing these programs because of the influence of the Israel lobby and of very powerful Jewish organizations inside these countries.
We've got Philip Giraldi on the line. Philip is going to be with us for another 5 minutes. It's great to have him on. He's a former CIA operations officer, worked in Europe and the Middle East. He's a terrific journalist. We've tweeted his article out about the recent events here in the UK. So do read that and do follow Philip there. And thanks again for staying with us, Philip. I'm delighted that Paul, because I knew about you, of course. Anybody who's worked in media for years, I'd known of you and who you were, but Paul sent me the article and said you should have a read of this. What do we do, Philip? I mean, and if you can consider that question, thinking about the Trump presidency. Trump has come in. People believe that it's a good thing because he's not an interventionist. That's what they believe. And I wish I could believe it, Philip. I'd love to think that he isn't. But I think what he's been doing since in the couple of weeks that he's been in, even before that with his appointments, is putting these neocons and bankers around him, and that worries me to death. And then you hear about Iran. So with that in mind, talking about him, what can ordinary blokes, as we say in the UK, what can we do about it?
Well, I think the best cure for a lot of these policies is exposing them and talking about them and getting into the media. Now with the alternative media, your voice can be heard. You would have been shut out before, but I think that's the important thing to do. I have my concerns about Trump, as you described them yourself. I believe that he came in talking about being a non-interventionist. For me, the most particularly important issue was, of course, mending fences with Russia, because none of us need a nuclear exchange in our futures. And so he said a lot of right things. And now, of course, I'm a little bit discouraged due to the events in Yemen and the pronouncements now about a safe zone in Syria, and most particularly about the comments yesterday about Iran.
Just before we part company for today, the safe zone in Syria, the alarm bells went off for me, Philip, and I'm thinking that's the Korea situation there. Are they trying to find a way to partition Syria? What do you think?
I'm not sure what the intention is here. I think he may possibly be trying to come up with some kind of formula that looks good, but doesn't involve the buzzwords of no-fly zone, which immediately conjures up images of Russian jets and American jets going nose to nose. So I think he's looking for some solution that's more so on the ground. But of course, if you talk to anyone serious about that, there is no solution on the ground unless you have 5 army divisions to do it, and we don't, and no one does. And so I think this is kind of a ploy. It's something that I feel is similar to his playing with the Mexican wall. I think this is something that will kind of be an election promise of sorts, and that will essentially kind of fizzle by its own lack of inertia.
Philip, I've loved chatting with you. Thanks for coming on. Is the best link to give for you theamericanconservative.com? Is that the best place to send people?
Yeah, that would be the best one, sure. Thank you.
Well, listen, thanks for doing it. I really appreciate it. And anytime you feel like coming back, you're more than welcome to do it. Thank you, Philip.
Okay, thank you.
That was terrific. Philip Giraldi on the line to us there from just outside DC, the former CIA operations officer, worked in Europe and the Middle East.